Hi there, Josh Sideris here. Today I wanted to talk about autonomous cars and their impact on the future economy. I'm going to make some predictions on how they're going to impact our day-to-day lives and about how they're going to impact prices and what I think the prices of autonomous cars will go. I actually think that prices of autonomous cars are going to be really cheap in the future. So I'll explain why I think that and also why I think that there's going to be a huge overturn of not just the auto industry, but also tons of connected industries, including ones that you might not expect. I'm going to lead into this topic by talking a little bit about Uber. Before Uber, we had to rely on taxis for our transportation. And of course, taxis, if you know anything about the industry and taxis almost everywhere in the world, it's a very highly regulated industry, and they pay a lot of money to lobbyists to keep competition out. And taxis are notorious for price gouging. So I've heard in some cities you have to pay like $50 a ride or something like that minimum. I mean, I've paid $50 for a taxi to go from downtown to uptown in Toronto. So Uber comes in and they disrupt the taxi industry by allowing anyone to be a taxi. Of course, you're not considered a taxi by these arbitrary legal definitions, but you're allowed to compete against the taxi industry. So you can run your own little miniature taxi business, and that has dramatically dropped the price of taxi prices everywhere in the city. Now, Uber is great because they compete against taxis, but they can't really compete against public transit. They can't compete against buses and trains. The reason for that is because buses and trains are able to carry many more passengers. Like, you might be able to fit maybe 50 people onto a bus. In an Uber, it's one person being driven by a single driver. So the amount of production per labor investment is very low with Uber compared with a bus. But somehow, the price, if you're carpooling with a few other people, the price of taking an Uber is somehow comparable to taking a bus in many places, depending on what city you're in. And I think that the reason for that is because the public transit in most cities is monopolized. You can't have multiple subway lines, and you can't have multiple bus services all taking the same route. It's counterproductive, and again, it's heavily unionized. And if you have private corporations running it, they still have monopoly over the jurisdiction that they're in, so they can drive up prices. And even if it's run by the public sector, you have unionized workers and unions that control the industry. And of course, they are incentivized to drive up prices for their own agenda, to grow the union, to recruit more people, to give their people more benefits. Just because it's run by the government doesn't mean they don't exploit the fact that they're a monopoly. So they're not price friendly either. Whether you have public sector or private sector public transit, the prices are always going to be high. Now, I won't get into which model I think is worse. I'll let you debate amongst yourselves in the comments. Autonomous cars actually solve this problem because they do to the public transit what Uber has done for taxis. Essentially, it would allow any person to own a car, to send the car out to do work for you, and you can have your own personal taxi service. So if you own a car or you have a fleet of cars, and I'm sure there's going to be entrepreneurs out there that have hundreds of cars roaming the streets of the city, looking for passengers, picking them up, dropping them off, and you're going to be able to compete against public transit very effectively, and you don't have to have a driver driving these things. So most of the price of this operation, which is the price of labor, is completely removed out of the equation, and then all you have to worry about is the price of the car itself, as well as the price of fuel and maybe insurance and a few other expenses. By removing the human out of the equation, you actually reduce expenses greatly, and so what that does is it creates a really interesting market pressure where now it might actually be cheaper to take a taxi. Of course, they're not going to be taxis. They're going to be, just a car share. So you're going to share someone's car. It'll be cheaper to do that than to own a car long term. Now, if you take a taxi every day to work, it's cheaper for you probably to just buy a car or to rent a car. but because it's expensive to take taxis, especially if you're living in a place where taxis are very expensive. But if you're using autonomous cars, see, once everyone has an autonomous car on the road and they're sharing it with other people, you're going to have a lot of competition for these for customers, and so people are going to have to compete on price. So customers are going to go with the service that gets them the best price, and maybe the service that has the best availability as well, and that's a big part of it. But there'll always be the ability for entrepreneurs to compete on price when it comes to these autonomous cars. That's going to drive the price of car sharing down. Now, eventually, there's going to come a point where it's just cheaper not to own a car. You can just rent someone else's car, borrow someone else's car for the day, and there's going to be so many cars on the road that you can borrow that the price is going to be like dirt cheap. It might even be like $1 per ride or 50 cents, and the availability will be super high. You need a car, it'll be there in 5 minutes, it'll pick you up, drop you off, and it's fast, it's safe, it's efficient. But on the other end, if you buy a car, it's like $30,000 or something like that, and it's going to be really expensive. So the market pressure that this is going to create is that fewer people will buy cars. Now, when something like this happens, the companies producing cars have a couple options. One option that these car companies have is that they can just produce fewer cars. So they can say, well, people aren't buying as many cars today. They're taking autonomous cars, so we're just going to continue selling cars at the same price and just sell fewer cars. It turns out that's a really expensive option because they might have to shut down entire factories in order to do that, and so that's a lot of wasted investment. And then you're going to have entire an industry shift where some car manufacturers might even go out of business. I think that if that happens, those companies that decide to continue the status quo, to sell their cars for $30,000 or $40,000, assuming that that's going to be the price of an electric autonomous car, that those companies will go out of business and they'll be replaced by companies who opt to lower the price of their cars. So this is the reason I think that it's almost inevitable that the price of cars is going to go down in the future. Because once people decide that it's cheaper for them just to subscribe to a ride-sharing program, they won't need to own a car anymore. There'll be no point to it, and so yeah, all these really expensive car companies, they're all going to go out of business, and they're going to be replaced by companies that rely on either cheaper labor or autonomous labor. But what's going to happen is all these companies with high labor costs are going to go out of business. That means all the unionized employees, they're all going to be, they're all going to disappear, and you're gonna have companies that rely mostly on automation or an ununionized workforce. And again, if this transition just doesn't happen, if let's say all the car companies decide that they're all going to price fix and none of them are going to compete on price, if that happens, then the entire industry will all collapse, because it's a byproduct of the fact that their own product is competing against them. Autonomous cars are a cannibalistic product. It's like cloud computing. IBM produces computers and servers that are used for cloud computing, but they also sell servers to companies to use as private servers. But cloud computing competes against private servers. So by selling computers that are used for cloud computing, they actually compete against their server sales. Now, I'm not sure if that resulted in a reduction in server prices, but the market for servers already closely resembles a free market, so prices are as low as possible because of the market forces involved. I mean, IBM has competitors. I guess they would just have to cope with a reduction in sales and have to deal with it by shifting their business model. But this cannibalistic market property applies to autonomous cars. By selling cars that are autonomous, you're competing against your own primary business model. But once these cars get into the hands of entrepreneurs, there's nothing that you can really do. People are going to use them to car share, and that's going to really take a toll on these car manufacturers. So they're going to have to compete on price. There's no choice about it, and it's completely inevitable. So all of these inefficiencies in the car industry, the car dealerships, which by the way, in the United States and in a lot of places, car companies are not allowed to sell their cars directly. They have to sell it through a dealer who adds a ton of markup to the car. College Humor did a whole spiel on this where they exposed the inflated prices and the inefficiency caused by these car dealers, and how corrupt the industry is, and how they lobby to prevent car companies from being able to sell their own cars. That's all going to go away. It has to. If it doesn't, the industry will collapse in on itself because people will just stop buying cars. Eventually people will just pay $1 or $10 a month or whatever it is, and these prices will keep going down until eventually there's no more car sales. That's bound to happen. It might happen in 5 years. It might happen in 10 years after autonomous cars become mainstream, but it will happen. It has to. And once that happens, the car companies are going to have to compete on price, and that means that they're going to be selling their cars for cost at the cost of manufacturing plus a small amount of margins as low as possible, and hopefully with any luck, it's going to bring the free market to the auto industry. And the free market hasn't existed in the auto industry, so it'll be nice to have the price go down. We might even see prices go down to 5,000. Who knows? But rest assured, the market will push the price down. But it's going to also put a lot of people out of work. Not just the people who drive trucks or the people who drive taxis. Yes, they'll all lose their jobs, but also all the people manufacturing the cars, they're all going to be put out of work because these car companies are going to have to really compete against car sharing on price. And if that means automating their workforce, they're going to do it. And unfortunately, we live in a world where manual labor happens to be priced very uncompetitively compared with autonomous manufacturing. And another industry that's going to be disrupted by autonomous cars that many people probably don't even think about is car insurance. Well, I have a friend who works in the insurance industry. He's a lawyer and he does claims against his insurance company. And I was actually just speaking with him yesterday, and he was telling me that his industry is going to be disrupted by autonomous cars, because what's going to happen is instead of people suing negligent drivers, people are just going to sue negligent manufacturers. So there's not going to be really much of a point of buying car insurance, since you're not the one driving anymore. You're the one, you're the passenger of this vehicle, and you rely on the manufacturer. So if something goes wrong, it's the manufacturer's fault, not your fault. That means you're not going to need insurance, and that means that the entire car insurance industry is all going to collapse because of the autonomous car, or at least that's the rumor that's going around in that industry. But this is something that I really wanted to talk about. Something that really pisses me off is when people say that all these job losses are bad for the economy. No, they're not. It's the opposite. This is a good thing for the economy. There's a story that Milton Friedman, who was a Nobel Prize winning economist, was visiting China, and he was touring a construction site when they were building a new canal, and he noticed that all the workers were using shovels to dig the canal instead of using high-end machinery. So when he asked the person in charge, that person responded that, well, you don't understand, this is a jobs program. To which Milton replied, oh, I thought that you were trying to build a canal. If it's jobs you want, then you should give these workers spoons, not shovels. The moral of the story is that jobs don't have an intrinsic value in the economy. What really matters is productivity. Now, I find that people just don't understand that. But if you have a machine that can do the job of human, and you hire the human anyway, you might as well just use the machine and pay the person to come into work and sit there and do nothing all day and go home and still pay them a paycheck. It's counterproductive. There's no point of having that. Free up that human. They can go out and they can contribute to the economy in other ways. Maybe that person who you lay off is going to go and start a business. They might start a restaurant, and they might hire more people. And there's another effect. If you're using autonomous solutions to compete on price, everyone's price of living goes down. So, in the example of a canal, that might be funded by taxpayer dollars. So if you can charge people less money on their taxes, that means they have more disposable income. That means that's more money that can be spent in the economy, and it's money that actually gets spent in a productive way. Instead of paying people to dig a canal with spoons, you're actually paying someone to cook you food, or you're paying for an experience, or you're paying for, if all your necessities of life are taken care of, then you can pay for people to produce arts. And there's a lot of other ways in the economy that you can spend that money. But if your prices go down because corporations or government are behaving productively and efficiently, then it stimulates the economy. It doesn't harm the economy. So it's actually good to lay people off. And people just don't understand that. They think that a lost job is bad for the economy. No, it's good for the economy. These are counterproductive jobs, and they're jobs that you can create more value, reduce costs for everyone, right? Like one of the big barriers to entry, by the way, of getting a job is getting to work. How do you get to work? You have to take public transit, and public transit is bloody expensive. And taking a taxi is expensive, and owning a car is expensive. So if you can get rid of these industries and replace them with a more efficient industry, or more streamlined and automated industry that is cheaper, that's really good, because it allows people to get to work. Now you can, it's like everyone owns a car, and they're owning a car for much cheaper than they can today. So that means that they can actually get to work. If you're living in the country, you can work in the city. If you're living in the city, you can work in the country, and you don't have to have an overpriced car. Your bills are lower, and again, that contributes to your disposable income. So you have more money to spend on luxury. So your quality of life goes up. So I hate when people say that this is bad for the economy. It's so good for the economy that and people don't get it. But this next industrial revolution that we could be facing is threatened by government. And when I say that the price of autonomous cars could go down, it really depends on whether or not the government comes in and prevents that from happening, which I strongly suspect that they will try. It's this idea that people are freaking out. They're worried that people are going to lose their jobs, and it's going to be disruptive to the economy because they don't understand the full scope of the economics. All they see is the seen effect of people losing their jobs. They don't see the unseen effect, where it actually it creates more jobs and more productivity long term, and it stimulates the economy. They don't see that, and so people are screaming and crying, "Government, regulate it! Tax these autonomous cars, prevent the free market from doing its thing, and jack up the price of cars and protect us from progress." And the government is going to be rubbing their hands together saying, "Oh, sure, we'll tax those autonomous cars. This will be, and they'll do it, and what you're going to get is there's a real threat that local governments, maybe not every government in the entire world, but certain governments, especially in North America, and governments and countries that are regulated by a more regulation-heavy government. I think we're going to see this possibly in Europe, possibly in the United States. I imagine in Canada, where I live, you're going to see the government come in. They're going to be regulating the hell out of autonomous cars. They're going to regulate who can produce autonomous cars as much as possible. They're going to put all kinds of restrictions on it. Of course, that's going to increase the price of cars, even though the price should be going down. And then the taxes. They're going to tax the shit out of these autonomous cars. You're going to have an enormous tax on the cost of a car. And the reason that the government will say they're doing this is because it protects the workers. It protects the people whose jobs are going to be eliminated. Their training, they can be retrained to enter the workforce. But of course, that's completely ridiculous. What's really going to happen is the government's going to use those tax revenues to maintain their operations. You see, with government, the government has a lot of employees. Typically in most first world countries, they have an enormous number of employees. Public teachers, you have garbage collectors, you have police, you have in most of the first world, you have public sector healthcare. So all the nurses and doctors are government employees, and government gets a lot of their money from the car industry. And already, these autonomous cars that are coming out, they're all electric vehicles. They're all going to be electric. They're switching off of fossil fuels. Oh, and I could do a whole video on the government role in fossil fuel production. I mean, what they do is they tax you at the pump, and then they turn around and spend that money on subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. And sure, some of the money gets spent on subsidies for other industries like solar and renewables, but it's all a gimmick, and a lot of it is run by the same companies that do the fossil fuels. And but ultimately, a lot of the money, probably the vast majority of the money, at least where I live, does go back to the fossil fuel industry, which is it almost seems like a scam. All these and people vote for that. They want the government to be taxing fossil fuels. They want a higher, they want a carbon tax. But what they don't realize is what they're allowing the government to be a monopolistic fossil fuel dealer, and it doesn't actually reduce fossil fuel consumption. I mean, it does a little bit, but people need to get to work, so they have to buy fuel. But we can see right through that. It's just a cash grab, and I actually think that it holds back renewable technologies like solar because it creates a perverse incentive for the government to not invest in solar or wind technology or any type of renewables because they make a lot more money selling fossil fuels at the pump. And the irony of this is that if you ask almost any person that is for renewables, they'll tell you that renewables should be able to compete against fossil fuels. Well, then let them compete. We don't need taxes. We don't need subsidies. If renewables are really superior to fossil fuels, then they should be able to compete against fossil fuels in a free market on their own without any government support. Of course, it backfires when government is underhandedly also supporting the oil industry that they claim they're trying to phase out. It's these energy companies that monopolize on the fact that there's very little competition allowed in the energy sector. But anyway, again, I could go on about this. It's all a big scam. But anyway, back to the topic that I was talking about. When the price of these autonomous cars goes down, the government is losing out on a lot of tax revenues because they tax you based on a percentage. In Canada we have a value added tax or an HST, and it's called HST. And what that does is it taxes you as a percentage of what you paid on the car. So if the price of cars goes down, the government's not making as much money, and so there's an incentive for them to jack up the prices artificially using a tax. And if they don't do that, then how are they going to pay for all their massive workforce? They have to pay for all these unionized teachers. They have to pay for the garbage collectors. They have to pay for firefighters. They have to pay for health workers. They have to pay for nurses. They have to pay for all these workers, and they can't do it if their income gets cut. They have to have that income coming in, and of course, if prices go down, then these workers in a free market shouldn't need to get paid as much as they are getting paid. But of course, the government has no way of reducing the salary of these unionized workers. There's just no way to do it, and so they have to increase the revenues. And meanwhile, if we allow the prices to go down as a result of automation, the average person will be able to live comfortably while making less money. The theory here is if prices go down but your wages go down, because of the reduction in prices, you can still live comfortably and have all the necessities of life paid for and buy luxuries, and you can probably have a higher quality of life. And that works in the private sector, but it doesn't work in the public sector because the government can't reduce people's wages in the public sector because they're so heavily unionized and the contracts prevent them from doing that, and they can't lay people off. That's impossible. So where are they going to get the tax revenue from? This is what happened in Venezuela. The government owned the oil industry, and they were using that to fund their big, massive government. And then guess what? The oil revenues went away, and then the government collapsed. And so did all the social programs that people were relying on, like food stamps. I can't see this not happening. The government's going to have to step in, and they're going to have to impose a ridiculous automation tax. It's basically going to hold back this next industrial revolution. It's really unfortunate because I think we're really on the cusp of something great. But it's going to be so counterproductive because we're afraid of progress. We want to hold back the technology, but it's going to monopolize it. And it's going to put it in the hands of a few companies instead of allowing all people to prosper from what's to come. The regulations that will inevitably be imposed by government are only going to result in crony capitalistic monopolies. For example, a worst case scenario would be that only a limited number of companies are allowed to produce autonomous cars, and then instead of selling them to consumers, they just decide we're going to produce these cars and then we're going to not sell them, we're only going to lease them out. So we're going to run all the car sharing programs so there's no competition, and then they can just charge whatever they want. They can charge even more than what you would have to pay if you were to buy a car, because it's all going to be over-regulated and there won't be any competitive forces to bring the prices down. And that's what really bugs me about articles and celebrities talking about how we should start taxing autonomous cars and providing benefits for people so that we can reintroduce them to the workforce. Our goal for society shouldn't be to create as many jobs as possible. It should be to create as much value as possible, to create as much productivity as possible. And if that means reducing prices by getting rid of unnecessary labor, that pulls everybody up, including the poor people. This is going to lower the price of food if we let it, but people are holding it back because they're afraid to let go. And the same thing happened in the Industrial Revolution in the 1700s and 1800s. But the Industrial Revolution happened, and we all benefited from it. Instead of working in the coal mines, working in the fields, or worrying where you're going to get your next meal from if the provider of the household gets sick, people were able to transition into much safer work and much more comfortable work. I think I've talked enough about this, so I'm going to wrap it up here. But I would like to say thank you if you've been keeping track of my channel and watching my videos. I haven't produced a meaningful video in a while. I've been working on a couple, but my last video was delayed because of false information that I found on the internet. I was actually making another transistor tutorial, but there's some confusion on some of the sources that I was using, so that's been delayed. But that'll be coming out shortly. But if you like these types of economics videos, I do economics, but I have an interest in a specialization, I guess, in technology. I'm going to be doing more videos like this, so be sure to subscribe. My number of subscribers has, I think, doubled or maybe even tripled since the last time I made a big video. So I'm glad to see that there's a little bit of growth there. Next video, if I have the time to make one, hopefully it'll be maybe next week or sometime. But I'm going to try to make a video on the economic feasibility of Bitcoin versus gold, which is a bit of a debate that's happening in the free market community. So I'll be talking about that whenever I have some time to make that video. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Bye bye.